They blocked him at the door, sneering that he didn't belong in their lounge. Subscribe if you believe no wealth or power justifies discrimination. Airport lounge staff denied entry to a black CEO. Seconds later, he bought the very building they were standing in, and what happened next will leave you speechless. The scanner beeped green, but the doors didn't move. Dorian Mays stood still, expression calm but puzzled, staring at the sleek, silver-framed glass panels that refused to part. Behind them, the Premier Air Executive Lounge shimmered with polished wood floors, low golden lighting, and the faint clinking of cutlery on fine porcelain. Just beyond the threshold, sharply dressed men lounged in designer chairs, sipping espresso and scrolling through tablets. Dorian shifted slightly, scanning his digital pass again. The terminal's gentle hum filled the silence. A clipped voice interrupted. "Sir, this entrance is restricted." Dorian turned to see a tall man in a fitted navy vest, crisp white shirt, and a nameplate that read Miles Hargan, Supervisor. His posture was stiff, spine straight as a ruler, lips pursed like someone perpetually displeased. He wasn't smiling. Dorian tilted his head, voice neutral. "I have a platinum-level membership and a qualifying first-class ticket. Is there an issue with the scanner?" Miles barely glanced at the device. "This lounge is for annual platinum members, not for day pass travelers or corporate upgrades." His tone wasn't angry, just dismissive, like a man brushing lint from a lapel. "I'm neither," Dorian replied calmly, though his brows pulled slightly together. "I've had an active annual platinum membership for 3 years. This pass is valid." The supervisor gave a tight smile. "There must be some mistake. Kindly wait outside while we verify." Dorian's jaw tightened, the muscles just below his ear shifting almost imperceptibly. He wasn't a man easily rattled, but there was something in the supervisor's tone, something that wasn't about policy. It was about presence. "I'll wait," Dorian said quietly, stepping back without turning away. He kept his eyes on Miles. "But let me ask something clearly. Are you refusing me entry because of a system error, or because of me?" Miles's expression didn't flinch. Instead, he offered a slow shrug, one hand extended in a lazy gesture toward the glass. "I'm refusing because this lounge has standards." For a long, thick second, the terminal seemed to still. The air around them tensed like a wire stretched too far. Behind Dorian, a pair of travelers lowered their voices. One leaned toward the other, whispering something while glancing in his direction. Dorian inhaled once, slowly, then he turned, not toward the exit, but toward the reception desk positioned a few feet away. A young man stood there, mid-20s, tall, thin, and clearly uncomfortable. His hands hovered above a tablet screen. A badge on his chest read Jonah, Guest Services. "Excuse me," Dorian said, walking over. "Can you check if my name is listed in your system?" Jonah blinked rapidly but nodded. "Yes, sir." I already did. You're on the active list." He swallowed and glanced toward his supervisor. "Everything's cleared. Platinum verified. Entry is approved." From behind, Miles' voice rose, cold and sharp. "That's enough, Jonah." The young man stiffened. Dorian's gaze moved between them. A younger staffer afraid to speak the truth. A superior confident he wouldn't be challenged. It was a pattern he'd seen too many times. Dorian stepped back slowly, reached into the side pocket of his blazer, and pulled out a black phone with a matte steel edge. He opened a secure app with a thumbprint scan and scrolled to a contact labeled V. Trask, REIT Division. A moment later, he pressed the call button. Miles gave a sarcastic chuckle. "Calling friends won't change our policy, sir." Dorian didn't look up. When the call connected, he said plainly, "Victor. Quick favor, who owns the lounge wing of Terminal 5 at Lenwick International? I need the full property structure, specifically the building block that houses the Premier Air Executive Lounge." There was a pause as the man on the other end responded. Then Dorian nodded. "Good. Make the offer. Triple market value. I want it closed by noon. Wire ready." A pen fell. Jonah's hand had frozen midair, his clipboard clattering softly onto the counter. His eyes darted from Dorian to Miles, then back again. The color drained slightly from his face. Dorian ended the call and placed the phone back in his pocket with the same quiet precision. He didn't raise his voice, didn't flinch. He simply walked back to the lounge doors and sat on the nearby bench, legs crossed, hands folded over his knee. The scanner light blinked once, then went dark. Miles stood by the panel, hands stiff at his sides. He turned toward Jonah. "Get back to work." But Jonah didn't move. He stared at Dorian, at the man who hadn't shouted, hadn't made a scene, but had just shaken the ground beneath the lounge with a single phone call. Dorian remained still, his eyes scanning the terminal calmly, as if nothing had happened at all. But every detail in his body language spoke of quiet authority, of storms that didn't arrive with thunder but with silence. He didn't need to yell. He owned the room without ever stepping inside. Miles shifted his stance, clearly unsettled now, though trying hard not to show it. He opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again. The silence between them stretched taut, and in that stillness, something subtle shifted, not in policy, but in power. In that moment, Dorian knew this trip would be remembered for something far greater than the contract. The glass doors didn't move. Dorian Mays stood in front of them, posture tall, expression unreadable, as the metallic scanner beneath the Premier Air Executive Lounge sign glowed green and then blinked back to black. A strange hush fell over the small group of onlookers waiting behind him in the terminal corridor. The air, moments earlier filled with the idle hum of rolling luggage and intercom announcements, seemed to still. From behind the glass, a voice cut through the moment like a blade. "Sir, this entrance is restricted." The man who spoke was already approaching, tall and brisk in his step, every thread of his pressed uniform screaming authority. His silver nameplate caught the overhead light. Miles Hargan, supervisor. The kind of supervisor who wielded his title like a badge and a sword. "This isn't for day pass travelers. It's for annual platinum-level members only," Miles said with a dry edge to his voice, as if rehearsed 100 times on lesser men. He didn't even glance at the scanner. His eyes were fixed squarely on Dorian. Dorian raised an eyebrow, but his voice remained composed. "I am a platinum-level member. And my boarding class includes executive lounge access." Miles didn't flinch. "There must be some mistake. Kindly wait outside." A few passengers shifted uncomfortably nearby. One or two whispered among themselves, recognizing the man now standing in quiet disbelief. Dorian Mays, the aerospace tech giant, the founder of Mason Technologies, wasn't unknown. His face had graced magazine covers. His software had helped win defense contracts. But here, in this moment, stripped of corporate backdrops and news headlines, he was just another man being told he didn't belong. Behind the reception desk, a junior staffer froze mid-step, clipboard in hand. His uniform tag read Jonah. Young, maybe mid-20s, clean-cut with a nervous energy in his shoulders. He hovered near the terminal, clearly hearing everything. Dorian turned his head slowly, locking eyes with him. "Do you see my name on your active pass list?" Jonah blinked. His fingers twitched as he tapped the tablet in his hand. "Yes, sir." "You're listed. Fully cleared." Before the relief could settle in, Miles snapped toward him with a glare sharp enough to slice steel. "That's enough, Jonah," he barked. Jonah lowered his gaze, retreating slightly. The authority in Miles' tone wasn't new. It was practiced, measured, enough to shut down questions before they began. Dorian studied the man in front of him. There was something familiar in Miles's demeanor, not just arrogance, but entitlement, cloaked in professionalism, the kind of man who drew invisible lines and dared others to cross them. Dorian didn't raise his voice. Instead, he stepped to the side of the entrance and pulled out his phone. The matte black device glowed to life in his hand. With one tap, he opened a secure contact list, a private directory few had ever seen. His finger hovered for a split second, then landed on a name, V. Trask, R.E.I.T. Division. The call connected instantly. "Victor," Dorian said, his tone calm and clipped. "Quick favor." "Who owns this terminal complex?" "Lounge building specifically." From behind the desk, Jonah's eyes widened. Miles scoffed audibly. "Calling friends won't change our policy, sir." But Dorian was already speaking again, voice low, precise. "Make the offer." "Triple market value." "I want it closed by noon." Jonah dropped his pen. The silence that followed was deafening. Nearby passengers began whispering again, their attention pulled fully into the unfolding tension. The hallway felt tighter somehow, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Miles let out a small, skeptical laugh. "You're bluffing," he said, shaking his head. "You expect me to believe you can buy the entire building with a phone call?" Dorian looked up, his eyes steady and unreadable. "I don't expect you to believe anything." He returned his phone to his pocket and clasped his hands behind his back. His stance wasn't confrontational, but there was weight in it. A silent storm held barely in check. Around him, the air shifted. The same stillness that had marked the beginning of the moment now returned, thicker than before. Jonah stood frozen behind the counter, glancing back and forth between his supervisor and the man he'd just confirmed as fully cleared. He'd seen wealthy travelers before, some loud, some humble, but none who radiated this kind of quiet certainty. There was something surgical in the way Dorian had handled the insult. No shouting, no complaints, just an order to purchase the building beneath their feet. Miles still didn't move, but the smugness had started to crack around the edges. He adjusted his tie and turned to another guest behind Dorian, pretending to check their pass as if the previous exchange hadn't just detonated a live wire in front of the lounge doors. Jonah dared to glance at the system tablet again. The access logs were still green for Dorian, but something else had just changed on the back end. A new alert pinged, "Request to verify terminal leaseholder." His fingers hovered over the screen. He looked up at Dorian, but the man gave no indication that anything had changed. Just a soft nod, as if telling Jonah, "Be patient." The real noise hasn't started yet. From deep within the airport's security network, silent systems began to shift. A property alert pinged a network administrator. A legal flag rose in the records of Gralin Trusts, the holding firm that owned the lounge's lease. And in a high-rise office across town, Victor Trask was already working the angles, scrambling numbers, unlocking leverage, and preparing one of the fastest acquisitions in his portfolio's history. But back in the hallway of Terminal 5, none of that was visible. All anyone saw was a quiet man in a blazer, standing calmly in front of doors that had refused him. He didn't look angry. He looked inevitable. Miles didn't know he'd just denied entry to the man who would soon own the floor beneath his feet. "Sorry, sir. I don't agree with him." Jonah's voice was barely above a whisper as he offered Dorian the chilled bottle of water. His hand trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the quiet pressure building all around them. Dorian accepted the bottle with a faint nod, his expression unreadable as he remained seated just outside the locked glass doors of the Premier Air Executive Lounge. From behind the sleek barrier, Miles Hargan leaned against the welcome counter, chuckling casually with a pair of suited guests. His laughter, forced and sharp, seemed designed to echo toward Dorian's position. Every so often he shot a smug glance in Dorian's direction, as if to remind him of the invisible line drawn between power and exclusion. But Dorian didn't flinch. He didn't blink. He sat with calculated calm, a quiet storm beneath still waters. On his phone screen, a message blinked. Offer submitted. Awaiting counter. Across town, Victor Trask moved like a man slicing through walls. The office lights of Trask Holdings burned bright even though the hour was nearing noon. Fingers flew over keys, screens blinked with legal documents, and every assistant knew not to interrupt him unless someone had died. The building housing Terminal 5's premium lounge, Victor had discovered within minutes, was technically owned by a lesser-known firm, Gralin Trusts. A legacy family office with scattered real estate holdings, Gralin had been seeking liquidity for months. Victor didn't hesitate. He crafted a full acquisition bid, not just for the lounge footprint, but for the block of land encompassing the attached commercial subunits and operational infrastructure. The bid was clean, aggressive, and backed with one line of steel in the proposal. Funds ready for release within 90 minutes. It was a number few holding firms could ignore, especially with a triple market clause attached. Victor pressed send, and immediately followed with a personal call to Gralin's CEO. "The buyer is serious. You've got 1 hour," he said coolly, his voice laced with certainty. "This won't come around twice." Back at the airport, the pressure inside the terminal lounge had shifted. Dorian was still seated, legs crossed, one hand resting lightly on the arm of the chair, but the air around him now pulsed with anticipation. A few passers-by had begun to notice him, not just as a man waiting, but as someone important. A child tugged on his father's sleeve, whispering, "Isn't that the guy from that space company commercial?" The father glanced quickly and turned away, uneasy, sensing something deeper unfolding. Miles, meanwhile, hadn't caught on. He walked back to the desk, smiling wide as he spoke to another guest about the lounge's elevated standards. He gestured toward the seating area. "We maintain a certain expectation here. Not everyone fits the image we promote." Jonah winced. Dorian's voice cut through the low hum like a scalpel. "You just watched a man turn arrogance into a resume bullet," he said quietly, not to Miles, but to Jonah. Jonah glanced at him, eyes wide, unsure if he had permission to laugh. Just then, Jonah's tablet vibrated. He pulled it up to glance at the screen and froze. "Sir," he said, voice hushed. "Something just changed in the system." Dorian didn't look. "What does it say?" Jonah swallowed hard. "The ownership flag. It just reset. It says pending override, granted, administrative redirect initiated, new holding, Mason Holdings, Incorporated." Dorian finally turned toward him. "Give it 5 more minutes." Jonah nodded slowly, but his eyes remained locked on the flickering screen. His heart pounded. This wasn't just a system update. It was a tectonic shift, and no one else in the lounge knew it yet. Inside the glass walls, Miles poured another flute of champagne for a pair of newly arrived travelers. He gestured broadly, still riding the high of imagined authority. "We take pride in who we welcome." Not just what they pay. Behind him, one of the mounted flat screens briefly flickered as a server refreshed. A tiny notification blinked in the corner, too fast for most to catch. But Jonah saw it, and so did the terminal's internal systems director, Neil Renner, who sat 6 levels up in the control hub. Neil squinted at the new redline update. Override access, executive structure. Mason Holdings now primary control. He reached for his earpiece, patched into the security line, and radioed softly. "Who's with Dorian Mays right now?" The supervisor on shift responded, "He's still sitting outside Lounge 5. Why?" Neil's voice dropped. "Because he just bought the entire building." The line went silent. In the lounge, the atmosphere remained falsely calm. Miles clinked glasses with a pair of investors, oblivious to the quickening pulse in the terminal's control room. Jonah stood near the panel, pretending to check check-in data, but inside, his chest surged with adrenaline. Dorian hadn't moved, but something around him had. A hum, a shift, a whisper of power reclaiming space. And still, Dorian didn't rise. He waited, not for permission, but for precision. Somewhere across the city, the final wire confirmation hit Growlin's banking channel. Victor texted a single phrase. "Cleared. Done. They're calling it now." And just like that, the lease that Flight West thought it held securely was worthless. The ownership had flipped beneath their feet. Miles chuckled once more at something one of the guests said, then turned only to see Jonah staring at him, eyes wide. "What?" he asked, stepping toward the glass door. Jonah opened his mouth, but Dorian answered for him, standing for the first time since the morning began. The building didn't even belong to Flight West anymore, but no one had told Miles yet. At exactly 11:58 a.m., the entire terminal's digital access grid hiccuped, a flicker no one noticed except the control room buried beneath Terminal 3. Inside, security manager Neil Renner sat with his sleeves rolled up and coffee half drunk when a sharp chime rang from his dashboard. He leaned forward, squinting at the alert. "New administrative control assigned. Mason Holdings, Incorporated." Neil blinked. That couldn't be right. This section of Terminal 5 had been under the same lease for nearly 15 years. He clicked through the layers of control metadata, and sure enough, the override came from the top of the private REIT chain. Whoever had triggered it had legal access, clearance authority, and an execution timestamp backed by the airport's Asset Exchange Division. He picked up the line to the lounge supervisor. "Miles, do you know who Dorian Mays is?" Miles Hargan had just finished delivering a chilled flute of complimentary champagne to an older couple seated near the fireplace lounge. He was already preparing to flaunt his status once again, arms behind his back, chin slightly raised, when Neil's voice crackled through the earpiece. "You're joking," Miles said, adjusting the collar of his suit jacket with visible annoyance. "No," Neil replied flatly. "He now owns the entire property block, including the chair you're standing on." The champagne glass in Miles's hand wobbled slightly, the bubbles within trembling as if they too sensed the shift. He turned his head toward the lounge entrance. On the other side of the still-locked doors stood Dorian Mays, calm, quiet, unbothered, but something in his posture had changed. He was no longer the overlooked traveler. He was the storm just before it made landfall. Dorian straightened the cuffs of his blazer with slow precision, then stepped toward the doors. "Mr. Hargan," he called evenly, his voice carrying just enough to silence the nearby murmurs. Miles turned fully now, pale, creeping up his neck. He had underestimated the man in sneakers. "Would you kindly reopen the lounge for me?" Dorian asked, his tone void of mockery or malice, just a command wrapped in dignity. Miles hesitated. The panel near him blinked green, waiting. A bead of sweat formed near his temple. He reached out, fumbling slightly, and tapped the override. With a soft, mechanical hiss, the lounge doors whooshed open. The room fell silent. Guests inside turned their heads toward the opening. Some still held half-filled drinks midair. Others leaned forward to see what the commotion was about. And there, stepping through the threshold with deliberate calm, was Dorian Mays, no longer on the outside. Every step he took echoed like a reckoning. His eyes moved slowly around the lounge, the leather chairs, the marble counters, the curated silence, all now under his control. He paused, letting the weight of the moment settle in the air like fog before a storm. Miles stood frozen near the host desk, his hands twitching toward the champagne tray he had just been parading with confidence. Dorian stopped a few feet from him, his gaze firm. "We'll talk in the office shortly," he said, voice still calm but with the unmistakable finality of someone used to being heard. "For now, you can wait with the other guests." Miles opened his mouth slightly, as if to protest, but then closed it without a sound. He backed away, retreating to the side of the room where moments ago he had ruled. Now he stood ignored by the very staff who once snapped to attention at his call. Dorian turned to Jonah, the younger staffer who had watched it all unfold with wide eyes and a clenched clipboard. "You're with me," Dorian said. "I'll need your help reviewing personnel files." Jonah blinked. "Yes, sir." As the two disappeared behind the office door, guests slowly began whispering again. Some took out their phones, others exchanged incredulous looks, but no one moved with the arrogance they had before. The air itself felt altered. Back in the lounge, Miles sat alone, his back against the glass, staring blankly at the digital display screen on the wall. The timestamp still glowed, 11:58 a.m., the moment the ground shifted beneath his feet. The man they tried to push out now controlled every door in the building. Inside the executive office overlooking the polished floors of the lounge, the door clicked shut behind Jonah with a soft hiss of finality. Dorian Mays had already removed his blazer and laid it across the back of the leather chair behind the wide oak desk. Without ceremony, he lowered himself into the seat, his expression unreadable but his movements exact, deliberate. Jonah lingered near the doorway, eyes wide with disbelief, his clipboard forgotten in one hand. "This is surreal," Jonah finally said, voice low as though speaking too loudly might shatter the illusion. Dorian didn't look up from the terminal he was unlocking. "It's just real estate and respect," he said calmly. "One I've owned for years. The other must be reclaimed." The office was sterile but elegant. Cool steel accents, a panoramic window that overlooked the lounge's central seating area, and a faint scent of citrus from a forgotten air diffuser in the corner. Jonah stepped further in, the hush in the room broken only by the soft clicking of keys as Dorian began navigating through the airport's internal employee database, something he now had full access to. Lines of data flickered across the screen. Shift schedules, tenure logs, training records. Dorian moved with precision, skimming over the surface until something caught his eye. A single name repeated like a dark thread through the archive. Miles Hargan. Dorian's jaw clenched as he clicked open one of the entries. It was a guest complaint, submitted just over a year ago. The text was short, but clear. Denied access despite valid platinum pass. Staff member appeared to ignore my explanation. Felt targeted. The complaint had been marked resolved, insufficient evidence. No follow-up, no disciplinary note. Another case. Then another. Then a sixth. All involved Miles. 3 of them, Dorian noted with growing anger, involved Black or Latino guests. One was a retired veteran traveling with his adult son. Another was a Spanish-speaking entrepreneur listed as a priority partner client. Each had proper access, and each had been turned away under vague reasons. System error. Ticket mismatch. Dress code violation. A deep breath escaped Dorian's chest as he leaned back in the chair. 6 reports, he said quietly. 3 racially motivated. All dismissed. He turned to Jonah, who now stood stiffly at the corner of the desk. The younger man looked uneasy. "Jonah?" Dorian said, his voice calm but layered with weight. "How many others do you think walked away quietly?" Jonah hesitated. I don't know, he admitted. Most people didn't file complaints. They just left. And we were told not to question rejections. Just follow instructions. Dorian nodded slowly, his gaze returning to the screen. That's how systems protect themselves, he muttered. For a moment, the room was silent again, filled only with the hum of the overhead lights and the faint echo of a luggage cart rolling past outside. Dorian tapped a few keys, cued the reports for print, and watched as the pages slid out of a sleek wall-mounted printer. He gathered the stack, paper crisp and damning. These aren't just employee files, he said, handing the stack to Jonah. They're a roadmap to the culture we've allowed to fester here. Jonah accepted the pages with both hands, glancing down at the summaries, his expression darkening with each line he read. So, what happens now? Dorian stood, buttoning his shirt sleeve, his voice cool but resolute. We're not just reassigning titles today. We're rewriting the culture below them. Through the glass, the lounge buzzed with hushed conversations. Guests sipped wine and scrolled through their phones, unaware of the silent reckoning happening just a floor above. Near the corner seating area, Miles Hargan sat hunched over, his crisp uniform slightly wrinkled now, his polished shoes no longer seeming to shine as brightly. His posture had changed, less commanding, more uncertain. And around him, the staff who once jumped at his orders now avoided his gaze entirely. At one table, 2 guests leaned in, whispering over their drinks. "Isn't that the guy who wouldn't let the owner in?" one asked, gesturing subtly toward Miles. The other nodded. "Sure, looks like him." Man, how the tables turn. Jonah watched them from above, then turned to Dorian. "They already know," he said quietly. Dorian didn't respond. He simply stepped forward, one hand resting lightly on the glass window as he looked down at Miles. It turns out the door he tried to guard was the same one that closed on his own career. Flight West just tried to renegotiate their lease terms. Victor Trask's voice came through Dorian's earpiece, sharp and tinged with disbelief. But they didn't read the fine print. You now own their emergency power supply room. And, get this, their entire backup data closet. Dorian, seated behind the executive desk in the lounge's glass-walled office, allowed himself a single, amused breath through his nose. So, they'll behave. Victor laughed. Exactly. But here's the real kicker. The regional press caught wind. You're officially the headline. Tech mogul shocks airline lounge with live buyout. You've gone local viral. Dorian didn't smile. He rubbed his temple lightly, then sat upright, focused. That was never the intention, he murmured, more to himself than Victor. Maybe not, Victor said, but you've got their attention now. Everyone's watching. A soft chime echoed through the office, pulling Dorian's eyes to the wall monitor. A message had appeared in bold letters. Notice to all staff, urgent meeting in conference room 130. P.M., attendance mandatory, new ownership briefing. Jonah, standing at the desk nearby, looked up from the printed personnel reports. You're addressing them. Dorian leaned back in the chair, his fingers steepled in thought. The lights above cast reflections across the room's glass panels, like fractured illusions of the clean, modern lounge outside. No, he said at last. I'm going to listen. I want to know what's been broken. Let them speak first. Jonah looked both surprised and relieved. You think they'll open up? They've never been asked to, Dorian replied. That ends today. At 1:27 p.m., the conference room lights flickered on. Neutral beige walls, a long oak table, and 15 leather chairs filled the space. The air smelled faintly of lemon-scented cleaner and freshly brewed coffee, but the tension inside was sharper than any chemical. Staff trickled in slowly, some adjusting their ties, others with nervous glances exchanged like whispers. There was Darryl from maintenance, still in his blue jumpsuit. Marcus, a shift lead, stood stiffly near the back. Several junior attendants clustered together near the door. None of them had seen the new owner up close since the buyout. They had only heard stories. The quiet man with the black laptop bag who now held the keys to everything. The door opened at 1:30 sharp. Dorian stepped inside with silent certainty, dressed simply, white shirt, blazer, no tie. He carried no papers, no slides, no screens, just presence. As he walked to the head of the table, the room fell into a hush that felt physical. He paused for a moment, scanning the faces before him, not just staff, but people. Each of them with routines, burdens, and silent stories buried under professionalism. His eyes landed on Jonah, who stood to the side, not speaking but clearly ready to intervene if things turned tense. "This lounge," Dorian began, his voice calm but resonant, "looks polished. On the surface, it appears well run, but what's been happening underneath doesn't." He walked slowly along the side of the table, not looming, but anchoring the room's gravity. "I'm not here to impress you. I'm not here to intimidate you. I'm here because I was denied entry to a place I paid for, qualified for, and had every right to walk into. But more importantly, because I suspect that I wasn't the only one." There was a long silence. Then a chair creaked. A younger staff member, eyes downcast, shifted nervously. "So," Dorian continued, stepping back to the head of the table, "before I say anything else, I want you to tell me. What hasn't been working? What's been happening when no one was watching?" The silence stretched painfully. Then Jonah stepped forward, voice hesitant but firm. "We were often told to filter guests. Without documentation. Just gut checks. If someone didn't look right, we were told to stall them." Another attendant, Marcus, nodded. "We'd get nudges to turn away people who didn't match the ambiance, even if their credentials were valid." Dorian listened without moving. His eyes were steady, but his jaw had tightened ever so slightly. Daryl, the older custodian, cleared his throat. "There were guests, elderly couples, Black and Latino professionals, students with premium cards who got blocked. I reported it 3 times. Each time I was told it was a system glitch." He looked at the floor. "I stopped reporting?" Dorian asked softly. "And who gave the instruction to filter?" Several eyes turned toward the empty seat that once belonged to Miles Hargan. "Sometimes directly from him," Jonah said. "Sometimes indirectly, but always with the same message: protect the lounge's image." Dorian's voice was quiet, but every syllable landed like a gavel. "You were protecting an illusion." At the cost of people, he stepped forward. "I need to ask you something, all of you. How many of you were told, explicitly or not, to look the other way?" Hands began to rise, slowly, awkwardly, more than half the room. Dorian looked around and the weight in his chest deepened. These weren't just isolated missteps, they were institutional habits, rooted in silence, rewarded with survival. "You did what you were told," he said, "because it was easier. Because you were afraid to lose your job." I understand that he turned back toward the table, his hand brushing lightly against the polished edge. "But understand this," he continued, "that fear, that silence, is how systems protect themselves. And it's how people like Miles build kingdoms on exclusion." He reached into his blazer pocket and pulled out a printed report, the disciplinary file on Miles Hargan. He laid it on the table like evidence in a courtroom. 6 complaints, 3 for racial profiling, marked insufficient evidence every time. "That ends today." His voice didn't rise, but it hardened. "This lounge is under new ownership, but more importantly, it's under new values." He lifted the file slowly, then looked each staff member in the eye. "There will be no silent punishments, no more filtered entries, no more reputations built on humiliation." He paused at the doorway before leaving, letting the final message settle into the bones of the room. He held up the file. This is the last time someone gets promoted for enforcing exclusion. Before you rebuild something, you have to hear how it broke." One by one, the voices began to rise inside the softly lit conference room, breaking through the still air like cracks in a frozen window pane. At first, the staff spoke hesitantly, each word carefully measured, glances flickering toward the door as if Miles Hargan might burst through at any moment. But Dorian Mays sat quietly at the head of the long table, his presence calm but commanding, arms crossed, eyes steady. He hadn't come to speak, not yet. He had come to listen. Jonah cleared his throat and looked down at the paper in his hand before folding it away. "We were told to filter guests," he said quietly, eyes flickering toward Dorian. "Anyone who didn't fit the image the lounge wanted to project. We were supposed to stall them, redirect them, say there was a system error or a last-minute policy change." His fingers fidgeted with the corner of his sleeve. It wasn't always said out loud, but the message was clear. There was a moment of silence, and then Daryl, the lounge custodian who had worked quietly for years without drawing attention, leaned forward in his chair. His voice was low and gravelly, the kind that carried the weight of time. "I've cleaned this lounge since it opened," he said. "I've seen people turned away for the wrong reasons. I filed a complaint once when a black family was denied entry even though I'd seen their credentials myself. It got labeled as a misunderstanding and disappeared." A few heads around the table nodded slowly. Others looked down at their laps, guilt etched into their posture. "They didn't want to upset a certain clientele," Darrell continued, his weathered hands resting flat on the table. "So they blamed the problem on glitches. But we all knew it wasn't the system. It was the people controlling it." Marcus, a younger staffer with sharp eyes and a coiled tension in his shoulders, leaned forward next. "Last fall, during that bad thunderstorm," he began, "an elderly black couple came in, completely drenched, just trying to find a quiet place to sit while flights were grounded. They had a platinum pass. I let them in. Miles found out and chewed me out in front of everyone. Told me I'd misjudged their presence." His voice broke slightly on the word. "Like we were supposed to be bouncers at a nightclub instead of hospitality workers." Dorian's jaw tensed. He hadn't interrupted once, but now he slowly turned his head to face Marcus. "What exactly did he say to you?" he asked, his voice controlled. Marcus hesitated. He said, "This lounge has standards, and that couple lowered the atmosphere. Don't let that happen again." The room fell into silence. Dorian's hand curled slightly into a fist on the table, but he didn't raise his voice. "And how many of you were told to look the other way?" he asked, scanning the room slowly. Almost half the hands in the room went up. That was the moment. Not the buyout, not the title transfer, not even the moment the lounge doors had opened under his command. This was the turning point. The unspoken truth was now spoken aloud, and it spread like a ripple through every corner of the room. Dorian rose from his chair, the soft leather creaking beneath him. He walked slowly toward the wall of windows, hands behind his back, staring out at the tarmac. Planes lifted in the distance, their engines muffled by glass and insulation. He didn't speak right away. The silence stretched, not with awkwardness, but with gravity. Then he turned back to face them. "Thank you," he said simply, and his voice carried more weight than if he had shouted. "Thank you for being honest today. I know what that cost some of you." He took a step closer to the table, his presence now towering, not just because of who he was, but because of what he represented. "Now, here's what's going to happen," he said, holding up the printed report on Miles. The file shook slightly in his hand, not from fear, but from restraint. "There will be no silent punishments, no more filtered entries, and no more leadership built on power trips." His gaze sharpened, eyes meeting each man at the table. This is the last time someone gets promoted for enforcing exclusion. Change doesn't come from a louder voice, it comes from refusing to stay silent. They thought humiliating a black CEO at the airport would go unanswered, but justice doesn't stay silent. If you believe dignity must always be defended, hit subscribe. Justice starts here. Miles Hargan barely had time to react before the words landed. "Effective immediately, your employment is terminated." Dorian's voice was calm, measured, like a judge delivering a verdict, not out of malice, but necessity. "For repeated ethical violations and documented misconduct." He placed the printed file down on the table between them. The weight of it hit harder than the words. Miles blinked, confused, then angry. "You can't." "I can," Dorian interrupted softly, "and I have." The office was silent but for the soft hum of the climate control. Outside the glass walls, staff members pretended to work, but their eyes kept flicking toward the conference room. They sensed something historic unfolding. Miles stood stiff, his face drained of color. His lips parted, perhaps to argue, to beg, to deflect, but Dorian raised a hand. "I'm not here to humiliate you," he said, "but you need to hear this. You had chances. 6 separate reports, Miles. 6. And not once did you stop to ask yourself if your behavior was part of the problem." His gaze didn't waver. "You could have been better. But you chose pride over growth. That's the real tragedy security had already been called." A quiet message relayed from the terminal control room. 2 uniformed officers stepped through the glass entrance and waited discreetly just outside, giving Miles a moment to gather his things. Jonah watched from the edge of the room, stunned, unsure if he should step in or stay back. Dorian nodded toward him. "Stay." Miles packed in silence. The cardboard box was small, but the weight of its symbolism was colossal. As he exited, escorted between the two guards, the hum of whispered voices followed him. The staff at the lounge had not forgotten the morning's events. They watched now as the man who denied access with such smugness was walked past the very seat he once controlled. A ripple of applause started, not loud, not mocking, but a quiet, cathartic release. It began with Darryl, the aging janitor, who gave a single, respectful clap before others joined in. The sound followed Miles like a tide receding from shore. Guests behind the glass turned, some rising slightly from their seats. Word was already spreading through the terminal. The man with the cardboard box? He was the supervisor who blocked the owner. And the man who had been told to wait outside? He now decided who got to walk in. Inside the operations room, Dorian turned to Jonah. "Your interim supervisor," he said. Jonah blinked. "Sir, are you sure?" "I am. Not because you agreed with me, but because you stood still when things were wrong. You didn't follow blindly." Dorian handed him a printed memo with his new title and authority to lead the next phase of training. "Don't just manage this place. Fix it." Jonah accepted the paper with trembling hands, his voice barely a whisper. "I won't let you down." Dorian stepped out of the office and into the main lounge, scanning the space with the quiet authority of someone who no longer needed validation. He spotted the regional manager for Flight West, Harlan Driggs, waiting near the beverage station, nervously straightening his tie. "Mr. Mays," Harlan began, trying to force a professional smile. "I understand the situation escalated today." "It didn't escalate," Dorian corrected, walking slowly toward him. "It revealed." Harlan nodded quickly. "Of course." "Yes, and we're committed to resolving." "No," Dorian said. "You're going to do more than resolve. You're going to transform." He reached into his briefcase and handed over a printed checklist. "This lounge reopens tomorrow. New staff handbook, updated policies, and every employee goes through retraining, mandatory. Focus on dignity, equity, recognition without assumption." Harlan flipped through the pages, nodding rapidly. "Absolutely. We'll coordinate with your team to—" "There's one more thing," Dorian added, pausing mid-step. He turned slowly, facing the lounge's reception desk where, just hours earlier, a glass door had refused to open for him. "Remove all access restrictions tied to discretion. Platinum members don't need to be filtered by face, posture, or accent." "Understood," Harlan said, subdued. "It'll be done." Without another word, Dorian walked past him into the terminal. The energy was different now, not louder, but sharper, grounded. Airport staff leaned slightly as he passed, not out of fear, but out of quiet recognition. Not everyone knew the details, but they knew something had changed, and that he was at the center of it. Passengers who had witnessed the morning's refusal now watched the same man walk calmly, confidently, and unapologetically through the same halls where he was once questioned. Dorian didn't carry a suitcase, just the same leather laptop bag and the kind of clarity that no pass, no ticket, and no nameplate could ever provide. He moved like a man who had nothing to prove and everything to uphold. And as he passed through the corridor and disappeared into the terminal's flow of travelers, the lounge doors remained open behind him, both literally and symbolically. A new chapter had begun, one built not on entitlement, but on earned truth. Sometimes the key to every door is knowing your worth and refusing to shrink for anyone. The doors to the lounge slid open with a soft whisper, revealing a space that felt reborn. Gone was the air of quiet judgment that had once hung like stale perfume in the corners. In its place was something warmer, calmer, yet firmer. Jonah stood at the front, dressed sharply in a charcoal vest over a pressed shirt, his new name badge gleaming beneath the word Operations Manager. He stood taller than before, his shoulders no longer weighed down by fear of doing the wrong thing. He greeted each guest with a smile, not the forced kind, but the kind that carried purpose. "Welcome," he said as a businessman approached. "Platinum access verified. Please enjoy your stay." The man gave a grateful nod, surprised at the lack of resistance. There were no hesitations, no sideways glances, just a smooth, human moment. From the far corner of the lounge, Dorian Mays watched in silence. He wore a muted blue sweater over a crisp white shirt, his blazer folded neatly beside him. A cup of jasmine tea rested in his palm, steam curling softly into the air. No entourage, no announcement, no ceremony. He was there simply to observe. The table he'd chosen was intentionally plain. No window view, no central placement. Just far enough from the action to see without being seen, yet close enough to feel the rhythm of the room. Staff moved with a new energy. They walked straighter, spoke more clearly, smiled not out of obligation, but out of assurance. It was as if someone had lifted a weight off their chests. Dorian took a slow sip, eyes scanning every interaction, every smile, every nod. This was not about revenge anymore. It was about proof. Across the room, a sharply dressed black man in his late 40s approached the counter. His briefcase bore the gold-embossed initials H.F., Halloran, and Fields, one of the region's most respected consulting firms. Jonah greeted him with the same composure as the others. "Welcome in, sir," he said, tapping the scanner. "All set." The man paused, blinking as if expecting a question or delay. When none came, he smiled faintly. "This is the first time I haven't been second-guessed in a lounge," he said, his voice calm but edged with years of quiet exhaustion. Jonah nodded, the compliment hitting deeper than he expected. He didn't puff his chest or thank the man. He simply answered, "That difference walked through those doors yesterday?" His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. The guest studied him for a moment longer, then gave a respectful nod and walked inside. Dorian heard the exchange. He didn't look up, but his grip on the teacup softened just slightly. At that same moment, Victor Trask's message buzzed into his phone, though he ignored it for now. He had already skimmed the headline earlier that morning. "Denied at the door, CEO buys building within hours." The piece was running in the Meridian Register and had already begun to spread through business circles online. Comment threads buzzed with equal parts disbelief and admiration. Words like power move, corporate judo, and legendary play floated beneath the article like digital confetti. But none of that interested Dorian. He had already told Victor his stance the night before. No interviews, no statements. Let the actions speak, and he meant it. Public praise felt shallow when the real victory was internal, when the real win was watching the guardrails come off a team too long suppressed. Back in the lounge, one of the newer hires, Malik, a college-aged floor runner, walked past with a tray of pastries and caught Dorian's eye. He slowed, recognizing the man who now owned everything from the glass doors to the lights overhead. "Good morning, sir," he said nervously. Dorian gave him a nod. "Good morning. How's the team holding up?" Malik blinked, unsure if he should answer truthfully. "Honestly, sir, better than I thought. Feels like we're allowed to breathe again." Dorian didn't reply at first. He simply gestured for Malik to carry on. As the young man disappeared behind a corridor, Dorian finally allowed himself a deep breath. Not out of relief, but out of recognition. These weren't just personnel changes. This was culture turning in real time. Beyond the lounge walls, the airport moved as it always had, families shuffling toward gates, pilots striding down polished halls, announcements crackling overhead. But here, in this small pocket of Terminal 5, something foundational had shifted. Dorian glanced at the entryway once more. Jonah stood firm, checking another guest in. The guest gave a small laugh after passing the scan. "Easy check-in today," he said. Jonah smiled back, calm and centered. "It's supposed to be." Dorian returned his gaze to the tea. The flavor had changed, maybe cooled, maybe grown sweeter. He wasn't sure. He didn't care. The lounge didn't need him to speak anymore. It didn't need him to intervene. It just needed to remember. The moment had passed. The lesson had landed. Dorian stood quietly, slid on his blazer, and made his way toward the exit without fanfare. No one stopped him. No one stared. And that was exactly the point. He stepped through the same doors that once refused him, and not a single sensor blinked twice. He didn't walk through the door to prove power. He walked through to prove presence. 3 days after the incident that had turned heads across the airport industry, Dorian Mays stepped into a sleek, glass-walled conference room on the top floor of the Lenwick Regional Aviation Authority. There were no reporters, no cameras, just a long oval table surrounded by 10 sharply dressed men, each representing different branches of airport operations: infrastructure, guest services, legal compliance, and internal oversight. The air inside was controlled, but not the tension. Some glanced at their notes. Others avoided eye contact altogether. All of them knew exactly who he was and what had happened just a few floors below. The chairman, a broad-shouldered man with silver hair and a trimmed beard, stood up as Dorian entered. His badge read, Clark Henley, Executive Board Chair. "Mr. Mays," Clark said, extending a hand, "thank you for coming. We know your schedule is demanding." Dorian shook his hand, calm but unreadable. "I'm here because this isn't about one lounge anymore." A subtle nod passed through the group. The door closed behind Dorian with a soft click, and Clark gestured for him to sit. "We've reviewed the recent shift in Terminal 5, Clark began, adjusting his cufflinks. "What you did, it was more than assertive. It was catalytic. Frankly, it exposed blind spots in our system we've ignored for too long." Dorian said nothing at first. He let the silence hang, his way of testing their sincerity. Another board member, a younger man with wire-framed glasses, leaned forward. "We've had complaints before," he admitted, "but no one ever held up a mirror like this." Dorian raised an eyebrow. "And now that someone has, what are you prepared to do with the reflection?" The room shifted, paper rustling, throats clearing. Clark nodded gravely. "We'd like to propose the formation of an advisory committee, headed by you, a multi-airport equity and experience panel. Your leadership would give it credibility and urgency." The idea wasn't small. It would mean oversight across multiple terminals, even in cities Dorian didn't operate in. It would mean stepping into bureaucratic spaces that traditionally moved slower than the industries he was used to, but it also meant impact, tangible, lasting change that extended beyond himself. "I'll do it," Dorian said, his voice steady, "on one condition." Clark's brows lifted. "Name it." "Every report we create must be public. Every finding. No redactions, no sugarcoating. If you're serious about reform, then transparency has to come standard." There was a brief pause. A few members exchanged glances, clearly weighing the political fallout, but Clark simply gave a tight nod. Agreed. The meeting ended without fanfare. No applause, no closing speeches, just an understanding. Dorian stepped out of the building into a quiet breeze, the sky above a soft gray, as if the weather itself was bracing for what was to come. Back at Mason Technologies, the mood was very different. His leadership team gathered in the main conference suite, already aware of the advisory offer. Marcus Elgin, the CFO, gave Dorian a long look as he stepped in. "You didn't just solve a personal insult," Marcus said, his voice rich with both admiration and gravity. "You lit a path for others." Dorian nodded once but didn't bask in the praise. His mind was elsewhere. That evening, after the office lights dimmed and the skyline outside turned amber with sunset, Dorian sat alone in his private suite above the company floor. A cup of untouched tea sat beside his laptop. He had logged into the security archives for Terminal 5, access now granted through his ownership agreement. The footage wasn't edited. No highlight reels, just hour after hour of raw, unfiltered surveillance. He watched silently as an elderly black couple approached the lounge desk with hopeful smiles, only to be waved away without explanation. Another clip showed a young Latino father with a sleeping toddler trying to clarify his access rights, only for Miles to shake his head and gesture security over preemptively. One video caught two white businessmen walking in without a scan check. Miles didn't even flinch. The contrast stung. Dorian's jaw tightened. He leaned forward, elbows on the desk, face inches from the glowing screen. Each video was a quiet bruise in the history of the space, moments that might have seemed small to outsiders but weren't. They were symptoms of something deeper, structural, learned, protected. He pressed pause on the footage, then opened the archive interface. His fingers hovered over the controls before tapping one command: Archive All. His eyes lingered on the screen for a few seconds longer. His reflection hovered faintly in the monitor, blurred but unmistakably there. "They were never just incidents," he murmured aloud to the empty room. "They were warnings. When injustice repeats quietly, it takes one loud act of principle to break the cycle." Dorian sat at the edge of a long glass conference table as the final slide on the screen faded to black. The room had emptied minutes earlier, the advisory committee members murmuring amongst themselves as they filtered out, visibly affected by the data they'd just reviewed, complaint patterns, demographic breakdowns, and real-time service disparity metrics pulled from anonymous guest reviews across multiple terminals. But now, the room was silent except for the hum of the HVAC vents and the faint tap of Dorian's pen against the table. He stared at the chart one last time before powering down the monitor. His reflection on the screen showed a man no longer fueled by frustration, but by purpose. He exited the conference room and walked briskly through the back hallway of Terminal 5, his footsteps echoing lightly against the polished floor. The once sterile lounge beyond the frosted glass entry had changed in more than just atmosphere. It breathed now. From the newly lit atrium to the warmth in the staff's interactions, everything felt intentional. As Dorian entered, Jonah spotted him and straightened instinctively. He wore a crisp vest, a fresh nameplate that read Operations Manager, and an expression that hovered between pride and responsibility. He had grown quickly into his new role. "Morning, sir," Jonah said with a respectful nod, eyes attentive but calm. Dorian offered a subtle smile. "I'm just observing today." He moved toward a corner booth, the same one he'd been seated in the day Miles denied him entry. But this time, there was no tension in the air, only focus. Staff moved with quiet assurance. Conversations flowed easily. And, most notably, guests of all backgrounds were greeted with consistency, not judgment. Across the room, an elderly black traveler in a slate-gray sports coat was guided in by a young attendant. No questions, no hesitation, just a handshake, a smile, and a warm, "Welcome, Mr. Benson. Your seat is right this way." Dorian's gaze narrowed slightly. The name caught his attention. After a few moments, Jonah walked over holding a weathered envelope. "Sir," he said gently, "this came in for you." Hand-delivered to the front desk this morning, Dorian took the envelope, its weight somehow heavier than expected. He opened it with care. Inside was a handwritten letter, delicate cursive on cream stationery. He read it slowly, lips parting as he reached the signature at the bottom. Charles Benson. Jonah noticed the shift in Dorian's expression. "Is everything all right?" Dorian didn't respond at first. His eyes were locked on the final lines. "Thank you. You made sure no one else has to sit outside a glass door wondering why they weren't good enough." He folded the letter carefully and placed it beside his phone. "That man," Dorian said quietly, nodding toward the lounge floor, "was once turned away here." Just like I was, Jonah's shoulders tensed. "I wish I could say I'm surprised." "That's exactly the problem," Dorian replied. The mood between them shifted. The victory wasn't hollow, it was hard-earned. But beneath the surface it was clear that this moment wasn't the end of the work. It was merely the beginning. Minutes later, Dorian returned to the executive suite upstairs. The office hadn't changed much, but the framed blueprint on the wall now bore a golden seal in the corner. Mason Holdings, Strategic Property Division. He walked to his desk, opened a drawer, and pulled out the original lease agreement, the one that had transferred control of Terminal 5's lounge into his hands. He placed the lease beside Charles Benson's letter. 2 pages, different fonts, but equal in value. One had cost millions, the other had cost history. His phone buzzed. It was Victor Trask. "Thinking of moving forward on the other terminals?" Victor asked casually. "We've already got interest from 2 airports." Dorian leaned back in the chair, eyes focused on the ceiling fan slowly rotating above. "Not yet," he said after a pause. Victor seemed surprised. "No?" "Not yet," Dorian repeated. "First, let's fix the ones that already exist." There was a brief silence. Victor understood. Later that evening, Dorian stood outside the lounge once again. The overhead lighting cast long, clean shadows across the marbled floor. Travelers moved past him without a second glance, some pulling briefcases, others chasing boarding calls. He didn't step inside. There was no need to. Behind the glass, he could see Jonah consulting with a staff member at the check-in desk. The new hire appeared confused, gesturing toward a family of travelers with hesitant eyes. But before uncertainty could bloom, Jonah stepped in and offered a gentle correction, firm but respectful. He placed a hand on the new employee's shoulder and nodded toward the guests. "They're good," Jonah said, calm and clear. "Everyone's good, until proven otherwise." Dorian turned away and kept walking, his pace steady, his heart quiet. When a man reclaims space with dignity, he leaves the door open behind him, for everyone else. The call came just past 7 a.m., crisp and unexpected. Dorian was reviewing security footage from a recent lounge audit when his phone vibrated with a restricted number. He hesitated for a beat, then answered. "Mr. Mays," a composed voice said on the other end, "this is Devin Keene, CEO of Flight West Airlines." Dorian recognized the name immediately. Devin was known for being calculated, rarely making a move without consulting 3 advisors first. The fact that he was calling directly, without warning, set a tone of urgency. "We've been watching the changes you implemented," Devon said, his tone carefully measured. "Frankly, our entire airport strategy needs rethinking. We'd like you to speak at our upcoming leadership summit." Dorian leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowing slightly at the phrasing. "I don't speak to impress executives," he replied calmly. "I speak when people are ready to change." There was a pause on the line. Then Devon's voice came back, this time softer. "That's exactly why we need you there." The invitation hung in the air like a quiet test. Dorian didn't answer right away. He didn't need the spotlight, and certainly not applause. But something in Devon's tone told him this wasn't just about damage control, it was about a system straining under its own denial. 3 days later, Dorian stood at the base of a minimalist stage inside the Solway Leadership Center, where the summit was already underway. The conference hall buzzed with murmurs as airline vice presidents, regional managers, HR leads, and board-level strategists filled the tiered seats. No banners, no showmanship, just rows of professionals in muted suits, many of whom had silently perpetuated the problems they now claimed to want to solve. Dorian stepped onto the stage in a simple navy suit, carrying nothing but his presence. There were no slides behind him, no bullet points, no rehearsed applause lines. He clasped his hands lightly in front of him and let the silence stretch until the audience quieted on its own. "I was denied access to a lounge," he began, his voice steady. "Not because of a missing pass, not because of protocol, but because someone made an assumption that I didn't belong. No one moved, not even to shift in their chairs." "That moment wasn't rare," he continued, letting his eyes scan the room. "It was routine. It just happened to meet the wrong man on the wrong morning." He told the story plainly, how a single denial had pulled back a curtain on policy, training, and unspoken codes. How assumptions shaped entry. How quiet prejudice was enforced not through rules, but through gatekeeping disguised as discretion. "The problem," he said, his voice growing firmer, "isn't access. It's assumption. And assumption is the child of unchecked power." The silence that followed wasn't passive, it was uneasy, cracked open by truth. Somewhere in the third row, a VP lowered his head. Another began taking quiet notes. In the back, a tall man in a gray blazer leaned back slowly, arms crossed, visibly unsettled. When the session ended, Dorian didn't linger. A few executives tried to approach him, some offering thanks, others seeking quiet absolution in the form of a handshake. But he nodded politely and slipped out through a side hallway, avoiding the post-summit reception entirely. That night, back in his hotel room overlooking the Meridian skyline, Dorian sat by the window with a cup of tea, still dressed from the event. The suit hung loose on his frame, like it had carried more weight than fabric should bear. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out the worn envelope he now carried with him on trips like this, Charles Benson's letter. He unfolded the page, running his fingers over the pen strokes. The final line always stopped him. "You didn't break the glass, you held it up to the sun." He read it aloud this time, quietly, letting the words sit in the still air. And some reflections are too powerful to ignore once they've been seen. The young man stood in line, shifting his weight nervously from one foot to the other. He wore a pressed navy button-down, a neatly packed briefcase slung over his shoulder, and eyes that darted between the entry scanner and the receptionist's desk. Behind the glass, the newly renovated lounge at Terminal 5 glowed with soft amber lighting, warm wood accents, and the gentle hum of quiet conversations, a far cry from the cold sterility it once exuded. A new hire, barely 2 weeks into his role, eyed the young man with suspicion. "ID, please," the employee asked, voice firm but hesitant. The man furrowed his brow. "I've scanned my platinum pass." It cleared green. He gestured to the blinking panel beside him. "I still need to verify," the staffer replied, tapping into the system. There was no malice in his tone, but uncertainty hung in the air. The pause stretched just long enough to draw attention from the nearby guests. An older man glanced over the rim of his newspaper. A couple in business suits looked up from their laptops. The atmosphere grew taut, memories of past mistakes not entirely erased from the building's walls. That was when a deeper voice spoke up from behind the counter. Calm, deliberate, and low enough to quiet the rising discomfort. "He's good," said the supervisor, stepping forward with confident ease. The staffer looked up, startled. The supervisor gave him a measured look, not angry, but clear. Everyone's good, he added, his gaze holding steady, until proven otherwise. The young man at the door exhaled softly, the tension in his shoulders easing. The scanner gave a final confirming beep, and the doors parted with a gentle hush. He stepped through, offering a quiet, "Thank you," unsure whether to look back or keep walking. The supervisor nodded and returned to his post, the moment handled without disruption, without spectacle. At the far end of the lounge, unnoticed by most, Dorian Mays sat in an unassuming leather chair by the window. His posture was relaxed, his blazer draped over the armrest, a steaming cup of chamomile tea resting on the small table beside him. He hadn't planned to speak. He hadn't even expected to stay long. But when he saw the hesitation at the door, when he saw the doubt begin to cloud an otherwise ordinary moment, he knew his presence still mattered. He observed quietly as Jonah, now dressed in a tailored dark gray suit, moved through the lounge with natural authority. His badge now read, Director of Terminal Experience. He checked in with staff, offered a brief greeting to a regular guest, and straightened a tray of neatly arranged breakfast pastries without being asked. The transformation was not just in job title but in posture, presence, and the ease of leadership that came from knowing the space around him had finally become what it was always meant to be: welcoming. Dorian took a slow sip of his tea. The flavor was calming, but his mind was alert, tracing every detail of the interaction. The way the staffer had hesitated. The weight of conditioning still lingering. But more importantly, the way the supervisor had intervened, not with reprimand, but with grace. That was new. That was earned. The decor had changed, yes. The sleek black and gold panels had replaced the sterile whites. The chairs were more ergonomic, the scent of citrus wood oil lingered subtly in the air, and the lights were softened to remove the harshness of the previous design. But the real difference was deeper. This was no longer a place people entered wondering if they belonged. It was a space where presence was enough until proven otherwise. Jonah made his way toward Dorian and stopped a few steps away. "We've come far," he said quietly, watching the team behind the counter. Dorian nodded. "You've led them well." "We're still learning." "But we're learning out loud now," Jonah added, a faint smile curling at the corner of his lips. "That's the only way forward," Dorian replied, setting his cup down gently. Jonah hesitated, then said, "You sure you don't want your name on the plaque?" Dorian glanced toward the lounge entrance, where a small bronze plaque had been mounted beside the glass door. It was elegant, understated, and powerful in its simplicity. He had approved the inscription months ago. Respect is not a courtesy. It is a condition of entry beneath it, no name. Just a single, bold line. Acquired, reclaimed, redefined. "No," Dorian said quietly. "It was never about the credit." A few minutes later, he rose from his seat, placed a folded newspaper on the table, and adjusted his sleeves. He walked through the lounge without fanfare, exchanging a nod here, a quiet smile there. As he exited, a flight information screen flickered nearby, announcing a slight delay on a Meridian City route. He didn't mind. Time moved differently here now. Outside the lounge, the terminal buzzed with its usual energy. Trolleys wheeled past, children tugged at travel-worn parents, and overhead announcements echoed through polished speakers. Dorian stepped aside to let an elderly couple pass, then turned back for one last look. Through the glass, he saw another guest approaching the entrance. Young, nervous. The same staffer from earlier began to speak, but the supervisor stepped forward again. No drama, no hesitation, just quiet correction. Dorian nodded to himself. No applause, no attention, just quiet correction, living on without him. The best revenge was never power. It was proof that the future could be better than the past. Moments later, their arrogance crumbled. The man they turned away signed papers making the entire building his. If you stand for protecting the innocent and demanding accountability, subscribe now. Together, we rise. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It sheds light on themes of racism, prejudice, and poetic justice when power and privilege are revealed. Its purpose is to raise awareness, provoke reflection, and inspire empathy, equality, and accountability in the face of discrimination.